I'm Monica Youn, and I'm a Constitutional Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Sure. The Brennan Center is a combination of a public interest law firm and a think tank and advocacy institution. And it is mostly lawyers, and we work on kind of fundamental, largely procedural issues of democracy and justice. On the democracy side, our work tends to focus on elections. On the justice side, we tend to work on liberty and national security issues, and also sort of access to justice, the availability of court procedures, and mass incarceration type issues. Well, the center was started by some of Justice Brennan's former clerks with his guidance and kind of blessing. But he made it very clear that he didn't want the center to just continue on, as if we were trying to channel the mind of Justice Brennan at all times. I mean, he knew and he trusted, I guess, the people he was working with to be concerned about the issues of democracy and justice that concerned the justice in his life, but not being kind of slavishly devoted to his memory. I don't think that there's any kind of core statement of Justice Brennan's that the center is trying to organize itself around. I mean, he was someone who sought solutions and saw problems in democracy and in justice, and I think that we try to give ourselves a relatively flexible mandate on those issues as well. Well, I have been, since my time at the Brennan Center, I have been in the democracy program, and I led their campaign finance reform work for some time. And for the past 2 years, I've kind of taken a little bit of a step back, and I've been in this fellowship physically located at NYU Law School, and I've been trying to think a little more deeply about sort of larger constitutional principles involved. Absolutely. I think that when I first started at the Brennan Center, I was much more engaged in the day-to-day battles of what was going on in campaign finance. I started there at 2008. Citizens United was decided in early 2010, and we were engaged in a lot of largely defensive litigation battles on campaign finance. The campaign finance opponents have brought literally hundreds of lawsuits, and we were defending those relatively strategically and also trying to advocate for particular legislation and reforms in Congress and in the states. Yeah, so I'm doing quite a bit more theory, and I'm thinking more about what are the core constitutional issues here. If we think that there's something wrong with the vision of the First Amendment as articulated by the majority in Citizens United, then how can we articulate what our sense of the First Amendment is that counteracts that? And so I haven't been nearly as involved in the day-to-day litigation battles and advocacy battles. I mean, I like litigation as something to do. I mean, litigation is kind of the sport of kings. It's a fun thing to do. It's like running marathons. It seems like it's enjoyable, but ultimately it's really bad for you. I'm not sure, however, in terms of overall game plan or strategy, that a primarily litigation strategy makes a lot of sense with the current composition of the court. I think that the court right now is on this kind of deregulatory track in campaign finance, and they keep taking these cases, and we sort of know what they're going to do, and we could just keep throwing ourselves against that wall and expend a lot of research and a lot of resources and a lot of energy, but there are not that many of us on the campaign finance reform advocacy side. We need to be a little strategic about how we're working. So if we are looking forward to a day when the composition of the court or the attitude of the court might be changing, then we need to be able to articulate how we think that ought to change. We ought to say, no, the First Amendment doesn't mean this, it means that. And, even before Citizens United and the recent kind of deregulatory turn by the Roberts Court, it was unclear that the more moderate wing of the court had any kind of unified view of what the Constitution demanded in terms of democracy. Yes, campaign finance reform and I think democracy more generally. I mean, even before Citizens United, we were losing cases on, for example, voter identification laws, that sort of thing. And I think it talks to, we would like to be able to articulate a more unified constitutional vision of participatory democracy. I mean, we are both a law firm and a think tank, and I think that we felt the need of a deeper and more robust constitutional vision that could guide litigation strategy, that could guide advocacy strategy, and that could, act in the realm of, I guess, thought leadership would be one way of putting it. One thing that I'm pretty involved in is sort of active outreach to the legal academy, to the people who teach students, to the people who testify in Congress, write amicus briefs in litigation. And, we think of all of that as being part of the same overall effort. I mean, we don't think of it as merely generative of litigation down the road. I don't think that it was missing. I think that it had been a little bit de-emphasized. There was a big constitutional push in campaign finance around the time that McCain-Feingold was passed, and a lot of, for example, the big academic thinkers were involved in the effort at the time, a lot of the kind of constitutional heavy hitters. And then McCain-Feingold was passed, and McCain-Feingold was a deeply regulatory law. It didn't, have big romantic details. It was very complicated, and I think election law got sort of taken over a little bit by specialists. No one was articulating anymore what were the fundamental justifications for what was, this very complicated regulatory regime. And so when these attacks on McCain-Feingold started revivifying, especially culminating in Citizens United, or maybe even further down the line, there was a sense that, wait a second, how do we justify this? The Supreme Court is saying that money is speech, and that the justifications we put forward for these regulations are inadequate. What can we say on the other side? Now, Citizens United was the culmination of decades of what can be thought of as ideological warfare. I mean, there has been a very concerted effort to make money not just related to speech but equated with speech, to make corporations not just have certain particular rights but the same rights as individual participants in a democracy. And it's been part of an overall agenda that can be traced back to the early 1970s. And the lawyer who brought Citizens United has brought over 100 lawsuits testing various parts of the campaign finance regulatory universe, and Citizens United was the one in which he's gotten the most success, but it's part of a much larger campaign. I mean, part of it is corporate civil rights, part of it is about the power of, I think, money. and money to act freely without regard to regulation. And you see this in the campaign finance arena, you see this in a number of other arenas as well. I mean, you see that in some of the current rhetoric that's going on about tax, about various kinds of corporate regulation, etc. The question is, should our democracy be considered a marketplace where whoever has the most money has the most power, or is there some sort of countervailing vision of what a democracy should be? Well, in theory, the decision comes down to two competing notions of the First Amendment. And I think that the Supreme Court articulated, I think, a very simple and in some ways a very charismatic vision that the First Amendment is about, in some ways, monologue, is about if you have the ability and means and wherewithal to speak and to broadcast your message as widely and as loudly as possible, then the First Amendment is about removing any limits on that kind of a monologue. I think that a competing vision that the Supreme Court had been open to over the past multiple decades that it's been thinking about these issues is that the First Amendment is about dialogue, and that the purpose of democracy in some way is to inculcate dialogue, and that at least is a competing constitutional vision that should be given some weight and that is equally involved with what we think of as First Amendment values. So the Bennett case in Arizona was a case involving a public financing system. And so you had private parties who could spend as much as private candidates who could spend as much as they want, who didn't choose to opt into the public financing system, and you had publicly financed candidates. Now the question was, what happens if a publicly financed candidate is in a race against a privately financed candidate? And, the state tried to budget in advance for its public financing candidates, trying to make sure that they were, had enough money to make them competitive. But what happens if that race is particularly a hot race? What happens if all of a sudden, rather than, a few, tens of thousands of dollars being spent on that race, hundreds of thousands of dollars are suddenly being spent on this race, and the publicly financed candidate is limited by the amount of grant money that she receives? Should you be able to give the publicly financed candidate additional grant money up till a certain level to make sure that the race is competitive and that the voters hear both sides of the issues? And the Supreme Court said no. Somehow providing additional publicly financed funds to the publicly financed candidates was treated as a restriction of a violation of the privately financed candidates' rights. Like somehow giving someone the money to respond to spending was considered to be a violation of the rights of the spenders. And I think even a lot of people who were on board with Citizens United and, well, if there's a direct restriction on the amount or the amount that a corporation can spend or the way a corporation can spend, that's a First Amendment problem. Even people who were on board with that thought that Bennett took it way too far. People like Charles Freed, who was, a former Solicitor General for the Republicans, just thought, what are we even talking about here? The whole level the playing field analogy is not something that advocates of reform have ever really supported. I think that it's this kind of boogeyman that the conservatives have come up with as to what they think that campaign finance reform is trying to achieve. It's kind of like trying to talk about health reform and using only the broccoli metaphor. The apt metaphor is, should the amount of money that goes into an election campaign be somehow related to the voluntary decisions of individuals? Like it never, so Exxon PAC was always going to be bigger than, tiny mom and pop corporation PAC. Tiny mom and pop corporation PAC was going to be able to spend, a couple of $1,000s, $10,000. Exxon PAC was going to be able to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that wasn't a problem because Exxon PAC was funded by shareholders and employees of Exxon who decided voluntarily that they wanted their money to go into a fund for political advocacy. The problem is when you have these vast sums of money that have nothing to do with the voluntary decisions of individuals to devote that money to political spending, and those are being used to, those are being kind of channeled into the political system in a way that has very little to do with the decisions of individuals. The metaphor that was used in Austin, which was one of the precedents struck down by Citizens United, was not a level the playing field metaphor. It wasn't saying everyone only gets the same amount of money and it's a problem if anyone has more money or speaks louder than anyone else. The analogy that was used in Austin was a barometer analogy, was the idea that the amount of money that's supporting these ideas should have some relationship to how popular these ideas are, to the decisions of individuals rather than the decisions of these corporate directors who are, dealing with other people's 401k funds to advance their own political agendas. The barometer means that there should be some relationship between the amount of money spent on behalf of a candidate or idea and the voluntary decisions of individuals. Like, no one complained in the previous elections, for example, in the 2008 election cycle, that Barack Obama was able to had a lot more money to spend than Dennis Kucinich because people were giving Obama money because they liked him, and fewer people were giving Kucinich money because they didn't like him as much. And so the idea that Obama has more money because millions of people support him, is not at all a problem. The problem is when you have a couple of people or some interest group or some individual who have a disproportionate amount of money compared to the actual support of their idea, but because they have a disproportionate amount of money, they're able to have an outsized influence on political dialogue. So the way Citizens United changes and, gets rid of this whole barometer analogy is, we had talked about ExxonMobil. So in the previous elections, ExxonMobil, if they wanted to influence elections, they would say, hey, let's form a PAC. And they would go around to their shareholders and officers and say, we want to support the ExxonMobil agenda in politics, and we want to do so by trying to influence the outcome of an election. So anybody who's on board with that, let's give money. Let's give individual donations. And ExxonMobil, in fact, did that in the 2008 election, and I think they raised something like $800,000, $900,000. I mean, some totally respectable amount of money. Certainly much more than many smaller PACs would have been able to raise. But after Citizens United, the amount of money that ExxonMobil is able potentially to access in order to advance its political agenda is no longer that $800,000 or $900,000 that's voluntarily given. It is instead the $40 billion or $80 billion available to it in corporate profits that are just available in its general treasury. They no longer have to have any kind of, let's tie this to individuals, let's talk about popular support, let's drum up support the way anyone else does. They can simply take advantage of funds that were that were given to them for corporate business purposes in order to influence political decisions. Citizens United, people like to talk about Citizens United a lot because it's very recent and very famous. Citizens United was by no means the beginning of this problem, and is not going to be the end of this problem. I think a lot of people focus on Citizens United in particular because it involves corporations, and a lot of progressives like to think of corporations as the man, the big evil. And, there are lots of different types of corporations, just as there are lots of different types of individuals. Individuals have always been able to spend as much as they want in independent advocacy, as long as they're not giving it directly to the candidate. They can run as many ads as they want saying, I really want you to support this person. What Citizens United did was give that same unlimited spending power for independent advocacy to corporations. Corporations, whether they be nonprofit corporations, for-profit corporations, whatever. And I think it used to be relatively difficult for an individual to say, I, as an individual, am going to run, millions of dollars in attack ads against a particular candidate. It just, was too complicated to do as an individual rather than as some sort of corporate entity. And so it has, in some ways opened the door to that. McCutcheon involves a law that's been on the books for almost 50 years, and it has to do with the amount that individuals can contribute. Now, Citizens United is in a different realm of spending. Citizens United is about independent expenditures. McCutcheon has to do with contributions. Independent expenditures are unregulated money, are unlimited, what used to be called soft money. But McCutcheon has to do with direct contributions to candidates and how much any individual is allowed to give in the aggregate. And it used to be, I think that the aggregate limits that are involved in McCutcheon reflect a principle that no one person should have too much political influence. That is fundamentally at odds with what we think of a democracy being. I mean, you should not be able to give the maximum amount to every single candidate, every leadership pack, every organization, every party organization, because then you would be able to become the sort of money power player that we are uncomfortable having, especially in the realm of direct contributions given to candidates and parties. I think that percentage has stayed relatively stable. Now, there have been some encouraging signs, and I don't know whether they've yet been enough to move that percentage significantly, but there was a lot of talk about the small donor revolution in 2008, and I think that worked kind of in both parties. Neither Barack Obama nor John McCain were the choices of the big money people in their party, of the big money establishment. And I thought that it was incredibly encouraging that these two candidates ended up getting their party nomination. Obama, I think, largely through small donations, and McCain through a combination of small donations, big donations, and public financing. And I think that with Citizens United and with the advent of the super PAC, that's changing. I mean, you're already seeing for the 2016 election Republican wannabe candidates dancing attendance on people like Sheldon Adelson. I find this whole specter just incredibly disturbing, that you're now going to have this oligarchy of mega donors who are going to be deciding who gets to be the candidate. I mean, this word corruption gets thrown around a lot, and and you have to think about what corruption means. This is one of the big fights that we're having on a conceptual level. The Supreme Court, particularly Chief Justice Roberts, seemed to think that corruption is no more than bribery. We already have laws against bribery, so why should we worry about some more expansive notion of corruption. I think that it's very hard to demonstrate empirically that vote buying exists. You would have to tap every congressman's office. You would have to, police every donor for every little wink and nod. I think that what money has been doing is fundamentally setting the agenda in this country. Why are we not having serious discussions about climate change? Why is banking regulation taking the shape that it is? Why is it so difficult to eliminate waste in defense contracting? In the wake of Citizens United, even the majority in Citizens United, even Justice Kennedy's opinion said, well, of course we have to have robust disclosure laws. And so, when Citizens United wiped out that part of the regulatory structure, there were not disclosure laws in place. And so it seemed a very reasonable thing, something that had a substantial amount of bipartisan support, to say, okay, well, if we're going to have this new category of independent expenditures and we're going to have various other new categories of political spending, let's at least have some disclosure laws. And so and so proposals were put forth, including what was called the Disclose Act. And, being involved in, I'm not a Washington person, I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not someone who gets directly involved in that kind of advocacy. But it was interesting to me, even looking from my perspective, that what happened with the Disclose Act was once the NRA got involved, it was just a no-go. It was kind of like not one politician was willing to stand up to the NRA because of the amount of money they would be able to spend against them in a real fight. It's kind of like, people keep saying, well, you can't prove that money has power. People aren't out there actively picking fights with these huge players. I mean, what you see is a mega money player like the NRA comes into a particular dispute and just shuts it down. They don't have to spend a cent to do it. I mean, it used to be that if you were a politician who was considering some sort of, for example, energy, climate change, cap and trade legislation, and someone from ExxonMobil came to you, you would know, okay, well, they have their, $900,000 PAC that they could spend directly against me, and that's, a bit worrying. But if you know that they suddenly have their $80 billion general treasury, that, obviously they're not going to spend all of that money against you, but it just increases the amount of money they have potentially available to bring to these negotiating tables by a factor of about 50,000. I mean, I don't think that's insignificant. What's extremely frustrating about Citizens United, I don't think that courts should be legislating the definition of corruption. We have a Supreme Court in which not one single person has ever held any kind of an elective office. You have McCain-Feingold. You have hundreds of thousands of pages of testimony. You have members of Congress saying this kind of spending, this kind of independent spending by corporations would corrupt us, would influence our judgment, would influence what kind of bills go to the floor, would influence, what goes where on the legislative calendar, would influence legislative decision-making at all kinds of level. We think that this kind of spending is corrupting. And what you have Justice Kennedy saying in Citizens United, an act of absolutely breathtaking arrogance, is to say, oh, I don't think that's corrupting. I don't think it's corrupting as a matter of law. Independent spending cannot corrupt politicians. I don't care what the politicians or the spenders have to say about it. Yeah, I mean, if there's a smoking gun and someone with an actual gym bag filled with cash, as happened in the ASCAM scandal in Arizona, which was kind of great, then you can do something like that. But that's, those kinds of incredibly crude efforts at outright bribery, notwithstanding what's happening in the New York City mayoral race right now, are extremely, extremely rare, and, only really get the small fry, only get the idiots. Anyone who is, a real corporation is not going to get their hands involved in something like that. They don't have to. It's not the most effective way to get things done. You don't have to, if you are going to a negotiation and you're heavily armed and, you're carrying a machine gun and your opponent is not, you don't have to fire the machine gun in order to get your way. And so for the Supreme Court to be looking for that kind of, smoking gun is absurd. I think that's right. The Supreme Court has been constitutionalizing more and more of this area, making it impossible for reasonable regulation to take place. I mean, it would be kind of like if, campaign finance is a complicated area under the best of circumstances, and you have politicians, some well-meaning, some not as well-meaning, working together on various regulatory compromises in order to get this very complicated system with a lot of loopholes, a lot of potential end runs, to function. I think of it as comparable in complexity to something like the tax code. Now imagine if the Supreme Court goes in knowing nothing about tax law and just constitutionalizes whole swaths of the tax law, like you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't have anything that functions like that. It would create a regulatory nightmare, and that's what the Supreme Court in its, in its arrogance is doing right now. I think that the term principle is perhaps problematic there. I think that the Supreme Court, in all sincerity, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, in all honesty, in all sincerity, believes that the First Amendment requires it to do what it is currently doing. I think that we're talking about a level of ideology. We're talking about, an ideological disagreement, but just because something is ideological doesn't mean it is not principled. I think the principled reason for the Supreme Court not to engage in this kind of constitutionalizing of campaign finance is that they don't know what they're doing. Politics is an area where there are always going to be speech values on either side. There's no, there are First Amendment rights, certainly, of individual spenders, of entities, of groups, of associations, and there are also First Amendment rights of voters, of participants, of listeners, of the audience. And there's no clear First Amendment right answer for the Supreme Court to enforce in sort of a bright line way. This is always going to be an area where there are constitutional trade-offs, particularly given that the Supreme Court knows nothing about politics. It has always been reluctant to get into what has been thought of as what has been called in previous Supreme Court opinions as the political thicket. Like, they don't understand it, they don't get it, and for them to go in sort of a ham-handed way will do a lot more harm than good. I mean, the original sin here is Buckley versus Vallejo, where the court said, look, it's fine to have limits on direct contributions, but independent expenditures, the sort of spending that's at issue in Citizens United, non-coordinated spending, poses less of a risk of corruption, so we're going to, call those limits unconstitutional. What you had as a result of that, at the level of, political, at the level of democratic policy, is you had money and power being pushed to the margins. You had money flowing to these outside loopholes and not to the candidates and to the parties. The candidates and the parties were bound by limits that these outside groups were not bound by. And you see, I think that part of the polarization of our current politics is due to the idea that it's much easier to send money to the fringes than it is to send money to the center. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which to achieve, there are all kinds of systems that can achieve political reform. How sympathetic the court is going to be to these various systems is quite another question. I mean, we've already had, just in the past few years, the Supreme Court kind of going around and picking targets. So you had them do independent expenditures, you had them do public financing, now you have them taking on contributions. And each time they're targeting one part of the system, and it's unclear what they're going to say we're just going to stay out of. I think the one thing that has shown some level of success has been public financing. I mean, you've had candidates be able to campaign very effectively on the platform that, look, I am not for sale. The money that I'm getting is coming from voters. It is not coming from these shadowy entities or these bizarre individuals. And so you've seen, for example, the Connecticut governor's race, the publicly financed candidate there was heavily outspent, both at the primary level and at the general election level, and still was able to prevail because he was able to tap into exactly that kind of messaging. Look, I'm not beholden to anyone but the voters. I mean, money has marginal diminishing returns, and I think everyone realizes that. And you really saw a lot of that in this past election where, people were trying to throw more and more money at the same television slots and the same media markets in Ohio and Florida, and were paying just, absurd amounts of money for these particular TV spots. And the television audience in the meanwhile had been oversaturated with these things. So it's unclear how much marginal effect all of this vast spending had. Oh, not at all. I mean, I think that money has marginal diminishing returns, but there are a lot of markets out there to saturate. There's a lot of leverage that was unused in this past election. This past election, I'm unable to speak to the strategy of the Romney campaign. With regard to super PAC spending, I felt like, you had a lot of conspicuous consumption spending in this last election, and just because some guy buys himself a Lamborghini doesn't mean he knows how to drive it necessarily. I mean, you just had a lot of these, these billionaires with their new political toys being like, oh, I'm going to take this for a drive. I bet I'm a brilliant political consultant, and I'm going to run these bizarre ads about communism with a tattered American flag flapping in the wind, and somehow I think that's going to be effective. Well, you're going to have, this was the first presidential election after Citizens United. You had the conspicuous consumers, the early adopters. You had the people who were eager to run in there without the sort of beta testing of this whole super PAC thing having happened. And I think that you're going to see smarter, and I think you're going to see stealthier spending in the upcoming elections. Super PACs were for people who really wanted people to know how much money they were spending on the election. Corporations don't do that. Yeah, I think that the counter is in the grassroots, both in terms of grassroots fundraising and also in terms of just boots on the ground. The labor unions were able to be incredibly effective in this past election because they were able to do, in some ways, what they had always done, which is knock on doors, have phone backs, because the labor unions don't just have a treasury, they have actual people. Well, legislation takes place in a lot of different ways, and it's, I think that, legislators, of course, have their own political agendas. In some way, they're looking to their own political survival, but there's a way in which a kind of détente in terms of spending can be pitched to legislators in a way that makes them do the right thing, that makes them feel like their own interests are involved in doing the right thing. So I don't think of grassroots participation as opposed in any way to policymaking or to legislation. You see different kinds of policymaking, and it's, especially public financing and its ability to incentivize and to increase grassroots participation. So, for example, in the New York City public financing system, after they instituted the multiple match, the percentage of people who gave to a politician increased by about, I think, threefold. And these were not large contributions. These were people giving $5, $10, in some cases more. But it just increased a level of participation and engagement so that people felt like they had bought a part of the campaign. And I think that model is now being considered in New York State. It's been considered a lot of other places. I don't think that a reform effort is going to start in Congress. I think it's going to start at a local level, and I think it's going to start in states. And, that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts right now. It's interesting. You see less political polarization in the state legislatures and less party line voting than you do in Congress right now. And in the states that have public financing system, you have 70 or 80% support and voting for public financing systems, both among Republicans and Democratic legislators. You have, people who participate in the system really like it because it means that rather than spending their time in little boxes dialing for dollars, they are going to spaghetti dinners with their constituents, and that's what a lot of them got into politics to do.